The thermometer nailed to the outside wall of Murdoch Gillies's cabin read 18 degrees below zero on that January morning in 1880. Inside, without his coat, he sat comfortably beside a modest fire, while 30 yards away his nearest neighbor's family huddled around a roaring hearth in a cabin that had dropped to 14 degrees inside. Before we get into how one Scottish homesteader built something his neighbors called insane, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories about forgotten frontier innovations move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story is even more impossible than this one. The difference was the iron bars. Hamish Dunbar had seen them going up around Murdoch's cabin 18 months earlier and had laughed along with every other homesteader in the northern Montana Valley. They had called it Gillies's cage, Gillies's jail cell, Gillies's madness. The iron framework surrounding the log cabin looked absurd, like someone had built a prison around their home. The bars ran vertically every 3 feet, connected by horizontal crossbars, creating a lattice that enclosed the entire structure. The curved roof framework, arching over the top, made it look even stranger, like a birdcage or a circus wagon. Nobody understood why a man would spend a fortune on railroad iron just to make his cabin look ridiculous. But on this morning, with the temperature 18 below zero and dropping, the mockery had stopped. Hamish stood inside Murdoch's cabin with his wife and 3 children, wrapped in blankets they had carried through the pre-dawn darkness when their own cabin had become uninhabitable. They had burned through 4 days of firewood in a single night, trying to keep the interior temperature above freezing. The walls had frost on the inside. The water bucket had frozen solid. His youngest daughter had started showing signs of dangerous cold exposure, despite being fully clothed and wrapped in every blanket they owned. Hamish had swallowed his pride at 4 a.m. and walked 30 yards through knee-deep snow to knock on Murdoch's door. The Scottish homesteader had opened it immediately, taken one look at Hamish's face, and said simply, "Bring them all." Now Hamish stood near the window, looking out at his own cabin barely visible through the blowing snow. Then he looked around Murdoch's interior. A single fire burned in the stone fireplace, not the roaring blaze Hamish had maintained all night in his own hearth. The firewood consumption was modest, yet the temperature inside this cabin was comfortable enough that Murdoch had been working at his table in his shirt sleeves when they arrived. Hamish's wife sat near the fire with their children, and he could see the color returning to their faces as warmth penetrated their cold, stiffened bodies. The thermometer mounted on the interior wall read 46 degrees. Not warm by normal standards, but compared to the 14 degrees Hamish's cabin had reached despite desperate efforts, it was the difference between survival and catastrophe. 32 degrees warmer, with less firewood. In a cabin that looked identical to every other homestead cabin in the valley except for one detail, the iron bars. Hamish moved closer to the window and studied the framework outside. Snow had accumulated on the horizontal bars and in the curved roof structure. The accumulation wasn't uniform. It had drifted and packed in patterns that suggested the framework itself was creating some kind of buffer. Between the bars and the cabin wall, he could see a gap of approximately 2 feet. Empty space. Dead air trapped between the iron framework and the log walls. He turned to look at Murdoch, who was adding a single log to the fire. "The air space," Hamish said quietly. "That is what does it." Murdoch nodded. "Trapped air does not conduct heat. It insulates. The iron bars are not the innovation. They are just the structure that holds the air in place." Hamish looked back out at the storm. His cabin sat out there growing colder by the hour, built exactly the way everyone built cabins, the way his father had taught him, the way that had always been sufficient, until it was not. Until winter came hard enough that traditional methods failed and people died despite their best efforts. "I called you mad," Hamish said. "You did?" "I was wrong." Murdoch added another small piece of wood to the fire. "You were not the only one." February 1878. The blizzard came without warning on a Tuesday afternoon. Murdoch Gillies and his uncle Alistair had been working on the south fence line of their homestead when the wind shifted and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than an hour. They made it back to the cabin just as the snow began falling in sheets so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. Inside, Murdoch built up the fire while Alistair shook snow from his coat. The older man was 63 years old and had been fighting a persistent cough for 3 weeks. The cold had made it worse. He settled into the chair closest to the fireplace, wrapped in a wool blanket, while Murdoch prepared coffee and assessed their situation. They had firewood, they had food, they had shelter. The cabin was standard construction, built the previous summer using methods Alistair had learned in Scotland 40 years earlier. Logs notched at the corners, chinked with moss and mud. A solid door, one window with a wooden shutter, and a stone fireplace that drew well. It had kept them comfortable through the previous winter. There was no reason to think this storm would be different, but it was different. The wind came from the north, with a ferocity that found every gap in the chinking. The temperature outside dropped to 20 below zero by nightfall, and kept dropping. Murdoch fed the fire constantly, burning through wood faster than he had anticipated. The cabin stayed tolerable near the fireplace, but the far corners grew cold enough that frost formed on the interior walls. Alistair's cough worsened. By the second day of the storm, he was struggling to breathe properly. The cold air aggravated his lungs. He stayed wrapped in blankets by the fire, but even there the temperature fluctuated as wind penetrated the walls and stole heat faster than the fireplace could replace it. Murdoch burned wood at an unsustainable rate, knowing their supply would not last if the storm continued, but unable to let his uncle freeze. On the third day, Alistair's condition deteriorated rapidly. The sustained cold had weakened him beyond recovery. His breathing became labored, his extremities were cold despite the blankets and the fire burning less than 6 feet away. Murdoch held his uncle's hand and felt the chill in his skin that meant the body was losing the battle to maintain core temperature. Alistair died that afternoon with the fire roaring and Murdoch helpless beside him. The storm continued for 2 more days. Murdoch sat with his uncle's body in the cabin that had failed to protect him, feeding the fire mechanically, watching wind penetrate gaps he had thought were adequately sealed, feeling cold air sink to the floor despite the flames. When the storm finally broke, Murdoch buried Alistair on the hillside overlooking the valley. He marked the grave with stones and stood there until sunset. The cabin waited below, the cabin that had killed his uncle as surely as disease or violence could have. Most men would have accepted that frontier winters were deadly and moved on. Murdoch could not accept it. The obsession that would consume the next 18 months began at that graveside. Spring came slowly to northern Montana in 1878. Murdoch remained on the homestead because leaving would mean abandoning everything he and Alistair had worked to build. The land was theirs. The cabin sat solid despite having failed its most important test. He could not stay in it without thinking of his uncle dying 6 feet from a roaring fire, but he could not leave it either. Instead, he began studying it with an intensity that worried the few neighbors close enough to notice. He spent hours examining the chinking between logs, noting where wind had penetrated during the blizzard. He used candles on windy days to watch flame movement near walls, identifying drafts invisible to the eye. He placed containers of water in different locations throughout the cabin overnight and measured ice formation patterns, mapping which areas lost heat fastest. The problem became clear through observation. Heat escaped through multiple pathways. The chinking, no matter how carefully applied, dried and cracked over time. The gaps at corners where notched logs met were particularly bad. Wind hit the exterior walls and penetrated, creating convective currents that stole warmth. The logs themselves, though thick, conducted cold from outside to inside. On the windward side, during storms, interior wall. Surfaces grew cold enough to create frost. Murdoch began visiting other homesteads within riding distance, asking questions that made people uncomfortable. How cold did their cabins get during the worst storms? How much firewood did they burn in a day? Had anyone died from cold exposure despite being inside? The answers were consistent. Cabins leaked heat. Fires had to burn constantly. Yes, people had died, usually the old or sick or very young, during prolonged cold snaps, even when they stayed inside with fires burning. Most homesteaders accepted this as the price of frontier life. Winters were harsh. Shelter was imperfect. You burned as much wood as necessary and hoped you had enough. The strong survived. The weak did not. That was reality. Murdoch refused to accept it. He started keeping a journal, documenting observations and theories. If heat escaped through gaps, could gaps be eliminated? If wind penetration was the problem, could walls be protected from wind? If log surfaces conducted cold, could that conduction be interrupted? The questions led to more questions. He sketched designs, crossed them out, sketched new ones. Hamish Dunbar rode by one morning in May and found Murdoch sitting outside the cabin with papers spread around him, covered in drawings and calculations. "What are you doing, Gillies?" Hamish asked. "Figuring out how to keep heat inside," Murdoch replied without looking up. "You keep heat inside by building a fire. A fire is not enough if the structure bleeds warmth faster than flame can replace it." Hamish shook his head. "Your uncle died. That is tragic. But you cannot redesign reality. Winters are cold. Cabins are imperfect. That is how things are." Murdoch finally looked up. How things are is not how things must remain. Hamish rode away, thinking grief had damaged Murdoch's mind. Other neighbors shared that assessment as word spread about the homesteader obsessing over cabin construction like an architect solving an impossible problem. By summer 1878, Murdoch had traveled to every mining camp and railroad town within a week's ride of his homestead. He was not looking for supplies or company. He was studying buildings. At a silver mine in the mountains, he observed how the manager's office stayed warmer than the bunkhouse, despite being the same size. The difference was location. The office sat protected behind other structures that blocked wind. The bunkhouse stood exposed on a ridge where wind hit it directly. In a railroad supply town, Murdoch spent 2 days examining a root cellar built with double walls. The outer wall was stone. The inner wall was wood. Between them, an 8-inch gap filled with sawdust. The cellar stayed above freezing through winter without any heat source. The owner explained that the sawdust prevented cold from reaching the inner wall. Dead air and material that did not conduct heat created insulation. Murdoch began forming a theory. Heat loss happened through 2 mechanisms: conduction through solid materials and convection through air movement. Stop both and heat stayed where you needed it. Thick walls stopped conduction, but did nothing about wind penetration. Sealed walls stopped wind, but still conducted cold through the material. What if you could create a barrier that stopped wind before it reached the walls, while simultaneously preventing conduction by introducing a non-conductive gap? He remembered stone buildings from his childhood in Scotland. Double-wall construction was common in castles and manor houses, though for different reasons. The gap between walls created defensive advantages and moisture control. But the principle was sound. 2 walls with space between them performed better than 1 thick wall. The problem was adapting that principle to frontier conditions. Building a second complete wall around his existing cabin would require as much work as building a new cabin. The weight would be enormous. The cost in materials and time would be prohibitive. There had to be a simpler solution that achieved the same effect. He thought about fence construction. Posts and rails created enclosures without solid walls. What if, instead of building a second solid wall, he built a framework that surrounded the cabin at a distance? The framework would not need to be solid. It just needed to block wind and hold airspace in place. Rails or bars spaced close enough that wind could not penetrate effectively, but open enough that construction would be feasible. The theory formed gradually through observation and reasoning. An external framework placed 2 or 3 feet from the cabin walls would create a dead air space all the way around the structure. Wind would hit the framework first, losing force before reaching the cabin. Cold would conduct through the framework, but the air gap would prevent that cold from reaching the cabin walls. The framework itself did not need to insulate. It just needed to hold still air in the right position. Murdoch filled pages in his journal with sketches, vertical posts supporting horizontal rails, various spacing patterns, different materials. The core idea remained consistent: create separation between exterior weather and cabin walls using a framework that costs less and weighs less than a second wall, while achieving the same insulation effect. Summer 1878 brought Murdoch to a railroad supply depot 60 miles east of his homestead. He had ridden 3 days to reach it, following rumors of a construction materials stockyard serving the expanding rail lines pushing westward through Montana Territory. The depot sat beside newly laid tracks, surrounded by stacks of timber, barrels of nails, coils of wire, and materials Murdoch had never seen in frontier settlements. The iron bars caught his attention immediately. They were stacked near a warehouse, each bar approximately 10 feet long, 2 inches wide, 1 inch thick. Structural iron used in bridge, construction, and industrial buildings. The depot manager explained they were surplus from a bridge project that had been completed under budget. The bars were strong, weather-resistant, and available for purchase at a price lower than their normal cost because the railroad wanted to clear inventory. Murdoch examined the bars carefully. They were heavy, each weighing approximately 30 pounds. The surface was rough-forged iron, not smooth-finished steel, but that did not matter for his purpose. He lifted one, testing its rigidity. It did not flex under its own weight. He imagined vertical bars like this supporting horizontal crosspieces, creating a framework around his cabin. The depot manager watched him with curiosity. "Building a bridge?" he asked. "Building a cage," Murdoch replied, still examining the iron. "A cage for what?" "For air." The manager laughed, thinking it was a joke. But Murdoch was calculating. If he placed vertical bars every 3 feet around his cabin's perimeter, he would need approximately 40 bars. Horizontal crosspieces connecting them would require another 30 bars. The curved roof framework would need 20 more, bent to shape. 90 bars total, plus brackets, bolts, and fasteners. The cost would consume most of his remaining savings from the pelts he and Alistair had sold before winter. Other men at the depot overheard the conversation. A teamster loading wagons stopped to listen. "Iron conducts heat," the man said. "You build with iron, you will freeze faster." Murdoch shook his head. "The iron is not the insulation. The iron holds the air in place. Trapped air does not conduct heat." "That makes no sense," the teamster replied. "Air is nothing. You cannot insulate with nothing." "You insulate with still air," Murdoch corrected. "Moving air steals heat. Still air holds it. The iron bars create a framework that keeps air still between the bars and my cabin walls." The men exchanged glances that said clearly they thought he was wasting his money. The depot manager shrugged and wrote up the purchase order anyway. Money was money, whether spent wisely or foolishly. Murdoch arranged for 90 iron bars, 2 dozen heavy brackets, 5 pounds of bolts, and specialized fasteners that could secure iron to wood. The total cost was $73, nearly everything he had saved. The manager asked how he planned to transport the iron. Murdoch explained he would make 3 trips with a borrowed wagon, hauling 30 bars at a time. The manager noted that most men who bought this much iron had crews and equipment. Murdoch was planning to do it alone. "Must be an important cage," the manager said. "It will keep me alive," Murdoch replied. He made the first trip back to his homestead with 30 bars loaded in a wagon borrowed from Tavish McLeod, a younger homesteader who had helped Alistair with fence work the previous year. Tavish had agreed to loan the wagon without asking too many questions, though he clearly thought Murdoch's purchase was unusual. The iron shifted and clanged during the 3-day return journey, announcing Murdoch's arrival long before anyone could see him. Hamish Dunbar was working his own fence line when he heard the wagon approaching. The metallic clanging was unlike anything he had heard before. When Murdoch came into view with 30 iron bars loaded in Tavish's wagon, Hamish stopped working and walked to the road to watch. By the time Murdoch reached his homestead, 5 other neighbors had gathered, drawn by curiosity, about what the grief-mad Scotsman had hauled back from civilization. Murdoch unloaded the bars methodically, stacking them beside his cabin. Each bar left a dull thud as it settled onto the growing pile. The neighbors watched in silence until Hamish finally spoke. "What is that for?" "Framework," Murdoch replied, not stopping his work. "Framework for what?" "For keeping heat inside my cabin next winter." Hamish looked at the iron bars, then at the cabin, then back at Murdoch. "You spent money on iron bars? To do what exactly?" "To create a structure around the cabin that will trap air and prevent heat loss." The gathered neighbors absorbed this statement with visible confusion. An older homesteader named Duncan Reed stepped forward. "You are building a second wall?" "Not a wall, a framework. The bars will stand vertical, connected by horizontal pieces surrounding the cabin at a distance of 2 feet. The space between will trap air." "That is the most foolish thing I have ever heard," Hamish said. "You are building a cage around your cabin, like a jail cell. And you think that will keep you warm?" "I know it will keep me warm." "How?" "Iron is cold. Iron conducts cold. You are surrounding your cabin with metal that will make it colder." Murdoch set down the bar he was holding and turned to face the group. "The iron does not insulate. The air insulates. Still air is one of the poorest conductors of heat that exists. Moving air steals warmth through convection, but if air is trapped and held motionless, it becomes an insulating layer. The iron bars are simply the structure that holds that air in place." Duncan Reed shook his head. "If you wanted still air, you could just build thicker walls." "Thicker walls still conduct cold through the material. An air gap does not conduct. It separates the cold exterior from the warm interior completely." The explanation did not convince anyone. A younger homesteader suggested that Murdoch should have spent the money on more firewood instead. Hamish asked if Murdoch realized how ridiculous his cabin would look with iron bars surrounding it. Another neighbor wondered aloud if grief over Alistair's death had damaged Murdoch's ability to think clearly. Murdoch returned to unloading bars without responding further. The neighbors eventually dispersed, but news of his purchase spread through the scattered homesteading community rapidly. By the time Murdoch made his second trip to the depot and returned with another 30 bars, people from homesteads he had never visited rode by to see the iron cage that Mad Gillies was building. The third and final load arrived in late July. 90 iron bars now sat stacked beside Murdoch's cabin, along with brackets, bolts, and fasteners. The pile represented nearly every dollar he and Alistair had saved. Tavish MacLeod helped unload the final trip and asked the question others had been asking. What if it does not work? Murdoch looked at the iron, then at his cabin, then at the young man. "Then I will freeze next winter with less money than I have now. But I do not believe it will fail." Late July, 1878. Murdoch began construction with the foundation posts. The iron framework would be heavy once completed, and it needed support structures independent of the cabin itself. He started by marking positions around the cabin's perimeter, spacing marks every 6 feet. At each mark he dug a hole 3 feet deep using a post-hole digger he had borrowed from Tavish. The ground was hard. High summer on the Montana plains meant baked earth that resisted the shovel. Each hole took hours to dig. Murdoch worked methodically, digging one hole completely before moving to the next. He needed 24 holes total to encircle the cabin. The work took 5 days of sustained labor under a sun that reached 90 degrees by midday. For the posts themselves, Murdoch selected pine logs approximately 8 inches in diameter. He cut them to 8-foot lengths, then stripped the bark and shaped one end to a point that would resist rot when buried. The pointed end of each post went into the ground 3 feet, leaving 5 feet above grade. Before setting the posts, he poured gravel into the bottom of each hole for drainage, a technique he had observed in railroad construction. Posts sitting in standing water rotted quickly. Posts with drainage beneath them lasted decades. Setting the posts required precision. Each needed to be perfectly vertical and positioned at exactly 2 feet from the cabin wall. Murdoch used a plumb line to verify vertical alignment and measuring cord to maintain the 2-foot distance. He tamped earth around each post in layers, compacting the soil to prevent settling. By early August, 24 posts stood around his cabin like sentries, their purpose unclear to anyone watching. Tavish McLeod visited during this phase and asked genuine questions instead of offering mockery. Why 2 feet specifically? Why not 3 feet or 1 foot? Murdoch explained while tamping earth around a post. Too narrow, and the air gap becomes insufficient for effective insulation. Too wide, and the framework becomes unnecessarily large and expensive. 2 feet provides adequate air volume while keeping the structure manageable. How do you know 2 feet is correct? I do not know with certainty, but observations of double-walled root cellars and calculations based on heat transfer principles suggest 2 feet should work. If I am wrong, I will learn from failure. Tavish watched Murdoch work for another hour, then helped set the final 3 posts without being asked. The younger homesteader did not fully understand what Murdoch was building, but he respected the methodical approach and clear reasoning behind each decision. When they finished the last post, Tavish stepped back and looked at the ring of vertical supports surrounding the cabin. It looks purposeful, Tavish said finally, even if I do not understand the purpose yet. You will understand when winter comes, Murdoch replied. August 1878 brought the vertical iron bars. Murdoch began attaching them to the foundation posts, working alone in the early morning hours before heat made the work unbearable. Each bar needed to be positioned vertically, plumb-checked, and secured to both the bottom post and a top connecting piece. The weight and awkwardness of 10-foot iron bars made the work difficult for one man, but Murdoch developed a technique using rope and temporary bracing to hold bars in position while he bolted them. He placed vertical bars every 3 feet around the perimeter, creating a cage-like appearance that made passing homesteaders stop and stare. Children from neighboring homesteads came to watch the strange construction, and their parents used Murdoch as a cautionary tale. That is what happens when grief takes a man's sense, one mother told her son while pointing at the growing iron framework. The vertical bars went up slowly. Each required drilling bolt holes through both iron and wood, a process that dulled drill bits rapidly. Murdoch spent evenings sharpening tools by lantern light, preparing for the next day's work. By late August, 40 vertical bars stood around the cabin, creating a partial cage that looked even more absurd than people had imagined. The structure served no obvious purpose, trapped no animals, enclosed nothing useful. Hamish Dunbar rode by one afternoon and sat watching for 20 minutes while Murdoch wrestled a bar into position. That looks like a jail cell, Gillies. You building a prison for yourself? Murdoch secured the bar before responding, I am building insulation. That does not look like any insulation I have seen. Because you have never seen air used as insulation, but you will feel it work when winter comes. Hamish shook his head and rode away. But his comment about a jail cell spread through the community. Within a week, neighbors were calling it Gillies's cage or Gillies's jail. Some used the terms mockingly. Others used them with genuine concern that isolation and grief had damaged Murdoch's judgment. A few homesteaders suggested that someone should check on him more regularly to ensure he was not becoming a danger to himself. Tavish McLeod visited frequently during this phase, asking questions and occasionally helping lift bars into position. He was the only neighbor who seemed genuinely interested in understanding rather than judging. "How will bars spaced 3 feet apart stop wind?" he asked one morning while helping secure a particularly difficult section. "They will not stop wind completely," Murdoch explained. "But they will break the wind's force significantly. Wind hitting the bars loses energy before reaching the cabin walls, and the bars create enough obstruction that air between the framework and cabin becomes relatively still. Still, air insulates." Tavish considered this while handing Murdoch another bolt. "So the bars create stillness?" "Exactly. That makes more sense than people think. Most innovations make sense once explained, but people prefer to mock what they do not understand rather than ask questions." By September, all vertical bars were in place. The cabin sat inside a complete ring of iron bars looking exactly like the jail cell Hamish had described. Murdoch began working on horizontal crosspieces that would connect the vertical bars and add structural rigidity. The roof presented problems Murdoch had anticipated, but not fully solved. A flat framework above the cabin would collect snow weight dangerously. Montana winters produced heavy snow that could collapse poorly designed roofs. If Murdoch simply extended his bar framework horizontally over the cabin, the accumulated weight during a major storm could damage the entire structure. He needed a design that would shed snow while maintaining the critical air gap between framework and cabin roof. The solution came from observing barrel construction at a trading post. Curved staves distributed weight along their arc rather than concentrating it at any single point. A curved framework over the cabin would create a dome shape that snow would slide off naturally, and the curve would be inherently stronger than a flat span. But creating curved iron bars required techniques Murdoch had never attempted. He built a large fire pit and constructed a bending jig using logs and iron stakes driven into the ground. The jig held an iron bar at both ends, while the center section could be heated and shaped. Heating iron to bending temperature required sustained heat and careful attention. Too little heat and the bar would not bend. Too much and the iron's structural integrity could be compromised. The first attempt failed. Murdoch heated the bar too quickly, creating uneven temperature distribution. When he tried to bend it, the bar kinked rather than curving smoothly. He set it aside and started again, heating the second bar more gradually, monitoring color changes in the metal that indicated temperature. When the center section glowed dull red, he used a lever arrangement to gradually apply bending force. The bar curved slowly, creating a smooth arc. Each curved bar took half a day to produce. Murdoch needed 20 curved bars to create the dome framework, meaning 10 days of dedicated work just on bending iron. He worked through September's cooling temperatures. Grateful that the fire pit provided warmth as autumn arrived, neighbors who rode past saw him working beside a roaring fire, bending iron bars one at a time with obsessive precision. Hamish Dunbar stopped one evening and watched the process. "You are bending iron bars now? For what purpose?" "The roof framework needs to curve. Curved shapes shed snow and distribute weight." "So you are building a curved cage, like a circus wagon, like an efficient structure that will not collapse under snow load." Hamish laughed. "Gillies, you have spent a fortune making your cabin look like something that belongs in a traveling show. I hope you can afford firewood this winter, because that cage of yours will not keep you warm." Murdoch continued working the current bar, gradually increasing the arc. "We will see what keeps warmth and what does not. I trust physics more than tradition. Physics is for educated men in universities. We are frontier homesteaders. We build what works. What works is what follows physical principles, whether the builder understands those principles or not. I am simply choosing to understand them." By early October, all 20 curved bars were completed. Murdoch began installing them, creating a barrel vault dome over his cabin. The bars attached to the top of the vertical framework and arched over the cabin, meeting at a center ridge line. The result looked extraordinary, a curved iron cage enclosing the rectangular cabin completely. Mid-October 1878, the framework was complete. Murdoch stood back and examined what he had built over 3 months of sustained labor. The cabin now sat inside a complete iron cage. Vertical bars every 3 feet surrounded the structure. Horizontal cross pieces connected them at 2 levels, creating rigidity. The curved roof framework arched overhead like a barrel vault. The entire assembly maintained a precise 2-foot gap between iron bars and cabin walls on all sides, increasing to 3 feet at the peak of the curved roof. The structure looked absurd. Murdoch acknowledged that freely. It resembled a birdcage, a jail cell, a piece of industrial equipment transported incorrectly and left surrounding a cabin by mistake. No other building in Montana Territory looked remotely similar. Children came from neighboring homesteads specifically to see the crazy cage that Mad Gillies had built. Adults came too, shaking their heads at the waste of money and effort. But Murdoch was not concerned with appearances. He was concerned with function. The framework created exactly what he needed, a buffer zone of trapped air surrounding his cabin completely. He added horizontal bars at ground level to prevent animals from entering the 2-foot gap. The last thing he needed was a family of skunks or porcupines nesting in his insulation space. The additional bars completed the enclosure. Tavish McLeod visited on a cold October morning when frost covered the ground. He walked around the structure, slowly, examining the construction from all angles. "It is finished," he asked. "The framework is finished. Now winter will test whether the theory is sound." "People are saying you wasted your money." "People said many things while I was building. Their opinions do not change the physics." Tavish stopped at the south side and peered through the bars at the cabin wall beyond. "The air between the bars and your cabin, that is the insulation. That is the insulation. Still, air is one of the poorest conductors of heat. Wind cannot penetrate the framework effectively, so the air stays relatively still. Cold from outside cannot conduct through the air gap. Heat from inside stays trapped. But will it actually work?" Murdoch looked at the younger homesteader with appreciation for the honest question. "I believe it will work based on observations and principles, but belief is not proof. Winter will provide proof." Inside the cabin, Murdoch prepared for the coming cold. He stacked firewood, organized supplies, and placed thermometers at strategic locations. He hung one thermometer outside the framework to measure exterior temperature. He placed another in the air gap between bars and cabin wall. A third hung inside the cabin. During winter, he would monitor all 3 and document the temperature differences. If his theory was correct, the air gap temperature would be significantly warmer than exterior temperature, and interior temperature would be warmer still with minimal fire. November brought the first cold nights. Murdoch recorded temperatures obsessively. Exterior, 28 degrees. Air gap, 34 degrees. Interior, with small fire, 48 degrees. The air gap was already providing measurable insulation, staying 6 degrees warmer than exterior temperature. The framework was working exactly as he had theorized. But November was mild. The real test would come when temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for days. That test was coming. Murdoch could feel it in the wind patterns and see it in the behavior of animals preparing for serious winter. December 1878 arrived with the first serious cold. Temperature dropped to 12 degrees below zero on the night of December 9th. Murdoch woke before dawn and checked his thermometers by lantern light. Exterior temperature read 12 below. The air gap between framework and cabin walls read 6 above zero, 18 degrees warmer. Inside the cabin, with the previous evening's fire reduced to coals, the temperature was 38 degrees. He rebuilt the fire, adding just 3 logs. Within an hour, interior temperature climbed to 46 degrees and stabilized there. Murdoch sat at his table and calculated firewood consumption. He was using approximately 1/3 the wood he had burned the previous winter to maintain higher interior temperatures. The air gap was performing better than his most optimistic projections. Over the following week, he refined his understanding of how the system worked. Morning temperatures were coldest, but the cabin retained enough heat overnight that rekindling the fire required minimal effort. During the day, even weak winter sunlight warming the iron framework transferred some heat into the air gap, providing passive solar gain he had not anticipated. At night, the trapped air prevented rapid heat loss that had plagued the cabin the previous winter. Snow began accumulating on the curved roof framework, and Murdoch observed something remarkable. The snow did not slide off as he had expected. Instead, it packed into the framework, creating an additional insulation layer. Snow was mostly trapped air, which meant his framework was now surrounded by natural insulation that enhanced the system's performance. The interior temperature rose 2 degrees after heavy snow, despite exterior temperatures dropping. Tavish McLeod visited during a morning when temperature was 8 below zero. Inside Murdoch's cabin, he removed his coat immediately. "It is warm in here." 44 degrees, Murdoch confirmed. "My cabin is barely 30 degrees with a fire burning since dawn." Murdoch showed Tavish the 3 thermometers and explained what he was observing. The air gap averaged 15 to 20 degrees warmer than exterior temperature. That warmth created a buffer that prevented cold from reaching cabin walls. Interior heat could not escape through the logs because the air gap blocked conduction. The system was working exactly as designed. Tavish studied the temperature readings with growing interest. "How much firewood are you using?" "Approximately 1/3 of what I used last winter." 1/3? To stay warmer? The cabin is not losing heat, so the fire only needs to replace heat lost through minor air leakage and the chimney. Last winter, the fire had to constantly replace heat being stolen through the walls by wind and conduction. Tavish sat by the fire thinking, "You were right. Everyone called you mad, but you were right. I am not right until winter proves it completely. December is not January. Wait until real cold arrives before judging success." But Murdoch knew the system was working. Physics did not lie. January and February 1879 brought disappointment of an unexpected kind. The winter was mild. Temperature rarely dropped below zero. Snowfall was light. The brutal cold that would validate Murdoch's system never arrived. His cabin stayed comfortable with minimal firewood, but so did standard cabins. Neighbors who had mocked his construction found their own cabins adequate for the mild conditions. The mockery intensified because Murdoch had built a fortress against weather that never came. Hamish Dunbar was particularly vocal. Gillies built his circus cage and wasted his money for the mildest winter in a decade. That is frontier justice for you. At the trading post, men joked about the iron cage that protected against imaginary cold. A traveling preacher used Murdoch as an illustration in a sermon about pride and overthinking God's simple provisions. Children made up songs about the man who built a jail to keep himself inside. The community consensus was clear. Murdoch had been wrong. His expensive framework was unnecessary, and mild winter had exposed his foolishness. Even Tavish McLeod, who had been genuinely interested, began expressing doubts. He visited in late February on a day when temperature was 28 degrees and both cabins were comfortable. "Perhaps the iron framework is excessive," Tavish suggested carefully. Murdoch shook his head. "The framework is not excessive for the conditions it was designed to handle. This winter simply has not produced those conditions. But you cannot know if it would work in extreme cold because extreme cold has not come. The physics do not change based on whether weather tests them. The air gap provides insulation. That insulation would be most valuable during extreme cold, but it functions in mild cold as well." Tavish left looking uncertain. Murdoch understood. It was easy to trust a system that proved itself dramatically. It was harder to trust a system that simply sat waiting for validation that never arrived. He had spent nearly everything he owned building something designed for catastrophic conditions. If those conditions never came, he looked foolish. But Murdoch was patient. He had not built the framework because he expected every winter to be catastrophic. He had built it because he knew catastrophic winters happened eventually, and when they did, unprepared people died. His uncle had died in such conditions. The mild winter of 1879 simply meant Alistair's death had occurred during an unusually harsh year. Eventually, another harsh year would come. The mockery continued through spring. Murdoch endured it without argument. He had not built the system for approval. He had built it for survival. Approval or mockery meant nothing compared to being alive. He spent the summer maintaining his homestead, repairing his framework where weather had caused minor damage, and preparing for the next winter. Whether that winter would be mild or severe, he could not know, but he was ready for either. November 1879 arrived with unusual early cold. By the third week, temperature had dropped below zero 3 times. Old-timers at the trading post muttered about signs pointing toward a harsh winter. Animals were growing heavier coats, birds were migrating earlier than normal. The wind patterns felt wrong. December confirmed their fears. A cold front settled over Montana Territory on December 7th and did not move. Temperature dropped to 15 below zero and stayed there for a week. Then it dropped further. By mid-December, morning temperatures were consistently 20 below. Night temperatures reached 30 below. The cold was sustained and brutal, unlike anything the region had experienced in recent memory. Murdoch's cabin maintained interior temperatures between 42 and 48 degrees with modest fires. He burned approximately 4 logs per day. His thermometer readings showed exterior temperature at 28 below, air gap at 8 below, interior at 44 degrees. The air gap was providing a 36-degree buffer between exterior cold and cabin walls. Without that buffer, interior temperature would be plummeting despite constant fire. Neighboring cabins struggled. Hamish Dunbar burned through firewood at an unsustainable rate, trying to keep his cabin above freezing. His walls developed frost on the interior despite fires burning day and night. Other homesteaders faced similar conditions. The mild previous winter had not prepared anyone for this. Wood supplies that should have lasted until spring were being consumed at alarming rates. On Christmas Day, temperature reached 35 below zero. Murdoch's cabin stayed at 46 degrees. He sat comfortably in his shirt sleeves, reading by window light filtered through frost patterns on the glass. Outside, the iron framework was covered in snow and ice, creating additional insulation that enhanced the system's already excellent performance. The curved roof prevented dangerous snow accumulation while allowing beneficial packing in the framework. Hamish's family was suffering. Murdoch knew this because smoke poured constantly from Hamish's chimney, indicating desperate attempts to maintain heat. He considered riding over to check on them, but decided against it. Hamish had been the most vocal mocker. Pride would prevent him from accepting help until conditions became truly desperate. January 1880 brought even colder temperatures. The cold snap that had started in December intensified. Morning readings of 40 below became common. This was historic cold, the kind that killed livestock, froze water lines, and made survival a daily challenge. This was the winter Murdoch had built his fortress to withstand. His cabin remained comfortable. The iron framework, the air gap, the careful construction, all performed exactly as theory predicted. Physics did not care about mockery or pride. Physics simply functioned according to immutable principles. Cold air could not conduct through trapped still air. Wind could not penetrate iron bars to steal heat through convection. The system worked. January 14, 1880. The temperature dropped to 18 degrees below zero by sunset and continued falling. Murdoch checked his thermometers before bed. Exterior, 22 below. Air gap, 3 below. Interior, 44 degrees. He added 2 logs to the fire, enough to keep coals alive through the night, and went to sleep under a single wool blanket. He woke to pounding on his door at 2 in the morning. Pulling on his boots, he opened it to find Hamish Dunbar standing in the darkness, breath freezing in clouds around his face. Behind him, barely visible in the moonlight, stood his wife and 3 children wrapped in every blanket they owned. "My cabin is 14 degrees inside," Hamish said without preamble. "My youngest is showing signs of cold sickness. Can you take us until morning?" Murdoch stepped aside. "Bring them in." The family entered quickly, and Murdoch closed the door against the deadly cold. Hamish's wife Margaret moved immediately to the fire with their children. The youngest daughter, perhaps 7 years old, was shivering uncontrollably despite heavy clothing and blankets. Her lips showed a bluish tint that indicated dangerous cold exposure. The older children looked exhausted from hours of trying to stay warm in a cabin where fires could not keep pace with heat loss. Murdoch added logs to the fire and pulled out extra blankets from his storage chest. Within 20 minutes, color began returning to the children's faces as their bodies warmed. Margaret sat with her youngest daughter wrapped in her arms, both covered by Murdoch's thickest blankets, positioned close to the fireplace. The family gradually stopped shivering as the cabin's steady warmth penetrated their cold, stiffened bodies. Hamish stood near the window, looking out at the night. The exterior thermometer was visible in the moonlight, 18 below zero. He turned and looked at the interior thermometer mounted on the opposite wall, 46 degrees, 32 degrees warmer inside than outside. With a single modest fire, less wood than Hamish had been burning per hour, in his desperate attempts to heat his own cabin. "The air gap," Hamish said quietly. "That is what does it. Trapped air prevents heat conduction," Murdoch replied. "The iron framework keeps wind from penetrating to the cabin walls. The air space between framework and walls stays relatively still. Still air insulates. The principle is simple once you understand it." Hamish continued staring out the window. Through the iron bars of the framework, he could see his own cabin 30 yards away. Dark now, fires extinguished when they abandoned it. He had spent months mocking what Murdoch built. He had called it a circus cage, a waste of money, evidence of grief-damaged judgment. He had been wrong about everything. "I called you mad," Hamish said. "You did. My pride nearly killed my children." Murdoch added another log to the fire. "Your pride kept you in an inadequate cabin longer than wisdom would have. But you came here before tragedy occurred. That required setting pride aside, which is harder than building frameworks." Margaret looked up from where she sat with her daughter. "Thank you for taking us in." "No thanks needed. Neighbors help neighbors survive. That is frontier law more important than any property claim." The family stayed through the night. The children fell asleep near the fire, finally warm enough to rest. Margaret dozed with her youngest still wrapped in her arms. Hamish sat awake, watching snow accumulate on the iron framework outside, finally understanding what he had mocked for 18 months. The extreme cold lasted 3 more weeks. During that time, 2 other families sought shelter in Murdoch's cabin during the coldest nights. His structure became a known refuge, the one building in the scattered homesteading community that could maintain survivable temperatures regardless of exterior conditions. Word spread quickly. Gillies had been right. The iron cage worked. People who had mocked him were now asking how he had done it. Tavish McLeod arrived on a morning when temperature had climbed to only 5 below zero, relatively mild compared to recent weeks. He brought a notebook and pencil. "I want to build a framework around my cabin before next winter. Will you teach me?" Murdoch spent 2 hours explaining every aspect of the design, the foundation posts and their spacing, the 2-foot air gap and why that distance was critical, the iron bars and how they were attached, the curved roof framework and how to bend iron bars properly, the horizontal ground-level bars that prevented animals from nesting in the insulation space. Tavish took detailed notes, asking questions that showed he was understanding the principles rather than just copying instructions. "Where did you get the iron?" Tavish asked. "Railroad supply depot, 60 miles east. They had surplus structural iron at reduced price. I do not know if they still have inventory, but similar material could be ordered." "And the cost?" $73 for iron, brackets, and fasteners, plus 3 months of labor doing the construction alone. Tavish absorbed this information soberly. $73 was significant money for a homesteader. 3 months of labor during summer and fall was time not spent on other necessary work, but the alternative was inadequate shelter during winters that could kill. Hamish Dunbar came by that same afternoon. He stood outside the framework, examining the construction with new eyes. Murdoch came out to speak with him. "You want to know how I built it," Murdoch said. It was not a question. "I want to know if I can afford to build it," Hamish replied, "and if I have time before next winter." "You have time if you start in May. The cost depends on whether the railroad depot still has surplus iron. If not, ordering new iron would be more expensive." "Would wood work instead of iron?" "I could cut and shape wood for free." Murdoch considered this. Wood could work for the framework if the pieces were substantial enough to resist wind pressure and if they were treated to prevent rot. The principle does not require iron specifically. Iron is simply strong, durable, and weather-resistant. Wood would require more maintenance, but could function. This possibility changed the equation significantly. If frameworks could be built using wood instead of expensive iron, the technique became accessible to homesteaders without substantial cash reserves. Hamish immediately began calculating what he would need. Tavish overheard this conversation and joined them, adding his own thoughts about wood framework construction. By evening, 3 homesteaders were planning framework systems for their cabins. The details varied based on available resources and individual circumstances, but the core principle remained the same. Create a structure around the cabin that traps still air between the structure and cabin walls. The trapped air provides insulation that prevents heat loss during extreme cold. Spring and summer. 1880 saw construction activity throughout the scattered homesteading community. Tavish McLeod started first, building a wood framework around his cabin using the principles Murdoch had explained. He used 8-inch diameter pine logs for vertical posts, spaced every 4 feet instead of every 3 to reduce material requirements. Horizontal crosspieces connected the verticals at 2 heights. His roof framework was simpler than Murdoch's curved design, using a peaked arrangement that would shed snow adequately. The air gap in Tavish's design was 18 inches instead of 2 feet, a compromise based on available materials and labor constraints. By August, his framework was complete. The structure looked different from Murdoch's iron cage, more rustic and less industrial, but the principle was identical. Trapped air would provide insulation when winter returned. Hamish Dunbar built his framework using a hybrid approach. He purchased some iron bars for critical structural elements, but used wood for most of the construction. His air gap was 20 inches, and his roof framework was flat, with significant slope to encourage snow shedding. The construction took him all summer, working alone in hours stolen from other necessary homestead tasks. A third homesteader, Duncan Reed, built the most ambitious variation. He constructed his framework using stone pillars instead of wood posts, creating a permanent structure that would last indefinitely. Between the stone pillars, he used horizontal wood rails to create the cage effect. His air gap was a full 3 feet, the largest of any framework built that summer. The construction required enormous effort, but Duncan was building for his grandchildren, not just himself. News of the frameworks spread beyond the immediate community. A mining operation 40 miles north sent 2 men to examine Murdoch's cabin and interview him about the technique. The mine operated year-round at high altitude, where cold was even more severe than the valley homesteads experienced. They were losing workers to cold-related illness and wanted solutions. Murdoch spent a day explaining the principles and showing them detailed measurements of his temperature differentials during the previous winter. The mining company built 3 framework structures around their most critical buildings that summer. They used iron throughout, sparing no expense for worker safety. When their frameworks were complete, the mine Superintendent sent Murdoch a letter thanking him and noting that the company was already observing improved temperature stability in the protected buildings even during summer temperature swings. By fall 1880, 9 structures in the region featured some variation of external framework insulation systems. Each was slightly different based on builder preferences, available materials, and specific needs. But all shared the core innovation, creating trapped airspace between exterior weather and building walls using a framework that prevented wind penetration and heat conduction. The phrase "Gillies cage" had evolved from mockery to technical description. People said they were building a Gillies cage or adding cage insulation when discussing the technique. Murdoch's name became attached to the innovation not through self-promotion, but through community adoption and respect. The winter of 1880 to 1881 tested all the new frameworks. Temperature dropped below zero repeatedly between December and February, though not as brutally as the previous winter. Murdoch's cabin performed flawlessly as expected. More importantly, the new frameworks built by neighbors also worked. Tavish McLeod reported interior temperatures 15 to 20 degrees warmer than exterior with modest fires. Hamish Dunbar's hybrid structure performed similarly. Duncan Reed's stone and wood framework exceeded expectations, providing excellent insulation while requiring almost no maintenance. By spring 1881, the technique had proven itself across multiple implementations with different materials and designs. The core principle worked regardless of specific construction details. Trapped air, insulated. Frameworks that created and maintained air gaps around cabins reduced heat loss dramatically. This was no longer theory or one man's obsessive experiment. It was demonstrated repeatable technology. Word continued spreading through the interconnected network of frontier communities. A trapper building a winter cabin near the Yellowstone River added a simple wood framework after hearing about the technique at a trading post. A family homesteading in Wyoming Territory built their cabin with an integrated framework from the beginning, incorporating the air gap principle into initial construction rather than retrofitting. A remote military outpost in northern Montana built framework protection around their barracks after a sergeant read about the technique in a letter from his brother who homesteaded near Murdoch. The innovation spread organically without formal documentation or institutional promotion. People who needed better winter shelter learned about frameworks from neighbors, from letters, from conversations at trading posts and supply depots. Those who understood the principle adopted it and adapted it to their circumstances. Those who built frameworks shared the technique with others facing similar challenges. By 1883, framework insulation systems existed on dozens of structures across Montana, Wyoming, and Dakota territories. The specific designs varied enormously. Some used iron, some wood, some stone, some combinations. Some maintained 2-foot air gaps, others used 18 inches or 3 feet. Some featured elaborate curved roofs, others used simple peaked or sloped designs, but all created trapped airspace between exterior weather and interior walls. The mortality rate from cold exposure in communities that adopted framework insulation dropped measurably, though exact statistics were never formally compiled. Frontier record-keeping was inconsistent, and deaths from cold often went unrecorded or were attributed to other causes. But anecdotal evidence was compelling. Families survived winters in framework-protected cabins that would have killed them in standard structures. Fewer children showed cold-related illness. Fewer elderly died during extended cold snaps. The innovation saved lives quietly, one winter at a time, without dramatic incidents or documented heroics. Murdoch Gillies remained on his Montana homestead through the 1880s. He expanded his land holdings modestly, added livestock, and lived the quiet life of a successful but unremarkable rancher. He never married. He never sought recognition for his innovation. When visitors asked about the iron framework around his cabin, he explained the principle matter-of-factly, without emphasis on his role in developing it. He was simply a man who had solved a problem that needed solving. By the 1890s, framework insulation had become established frontier technology in cold regions. New construction sometimes incorporated framework principles from the beginning. Mining companies, building in mountains, used framework protection as standard practice. Remote trading posts and way stations featured frameworks. The technique had entered the collective knowledge of frontier building without anyone tracking its spread or crediting its origin. Murdoch died in April 1897 at age 58. A spring fever took him quickly, despite his robust constitution. He was buried on his homestead next to his uncle Alastair on the hillside overlooking the valley where they had first settled 19 years earlier. His gravestone was simple, listing only his name and dates. No mention of innovations or techniques. No recognition of lives saved. His cabin remained standing, the iron framework still solid after 2 decades of Montana weather. A younger homesteader purchased the property and lived in the cabin for another 15 years, benefiting from insulation built by a man he had never met. The framework required minimal maintenance. Iron did not rot. The foundation posts remained solid. The curved roof continued shedding snow efficiently. Into the 1900s, scattered examples of framework-insulated structures could still be found across the Northern Territories. Many had fallen into disuse as towns grew and modern construction methods spread. But some remained functional, quiet testaments to a principle discovered through grief and proven through obsessive attention to physics and careful construction. The story of how framework insulation developed was never formally recorded. Murdoch left no written account. The neighbors who witnessed the original construction eventually died without documenting what they had seen. The innovation persisted in practice, but faded from memory as a specific invention with a specific inventor. It became simply one technique among many that frontier people had used to survive harsh conditions. But the principle Murdoch proved remained valid. Trapped, still, air insulates. External frameworks that create air gaps reduce heat loss. Simple physics applied thoughtfully solves problems that brute force cannot. And sometimes the most valuable innovations are not weapons or tools or dramatic technologies, but better ways of doing fundamental things, better ways of keeping warm, better ways of surviving, better ways of protecting the people who depend on shelter when winter comes hard and unforgiving. That legacy, carried in structures scattered across territories and in knowledge passed quietly between builders, was enough. Murdoch had not built his cage for recognition. He had built it to survive. And in building it, he had given others the means to survive as well.